Good day. Welcome to the Talk It Out podcast. My name is Neal Bailey-Harper, and I'm here today with Story Time. White liquor in the summer. The village of my upbringing, and some things my mama taught me. Hey, thanks for listening. Welcome to the Talk It Out podcast. I want to talk to you today about a story that I lived through. It has always taken a village to raise a child. It really has. And I grew up in Philadelphia in the 1960s and 70s. And while we look back on those times, things were as fruitful then as they were now. I grew up in 2124 West Master Street, which is a area of North Philadelphia, and I never ever will call my neighborhood the hood. I lived in a neighborhood. Row houses on each block. Master Street had approximately 52 houses on this whole block. There were 26 on the left side of the street, 26 on the right side of the street, and it was a one-way street. My address was 2124 West Master Street, and everybody on that block knew everybody else on that block because the houses were there. And normally some variation of that family in the 20, 30 years that you could start your life living, that family stayed in those houses. Again, this was the 60s and the early 70s in North Philadelphia. One thing I will say about my neighborhood that I remember when I look at neighborhoods today, and I've been out of Philadelphia for a while, so I'm not sure if firstly, I am sure there's a lot of neighborhoods that remain the same, but there's a lot that have changed. But at that time in my neighborhood, within walking distance of a very low income neighborhood, there were 3 local grocery stores. There was a library. There was a medical center. There was a private doctor's office. There was a funeral home. There was a gas station, 2 restaurants, and 3 local bars. Now, the funny thing about it, in North Philly, they were called bars. In South Philly or Northeast Philadelphia, they were called taverns. Either way, they were establishments where alcohol could be served beginning at 12 o'clock in the day. The other thing about the neighborhood bars and the grocery stores in our neighborhood, they were all places of commerce. Um, there was more than just food sold in grocery stores. That's where the local numbers were played. That's where deals were made. Somebody selling a car to somebody else, somebody providing somebody with the service that they wanted. That's how it was in the local bars. Deals were made, numbers were played. We played, before there was a state lottery, there was also always a local lottery. From my understanding, numbers were picked out of the daily paper, unbeknownst to anyone, and put into a can. There were number guys who used to walk around the neighborhood with a brown paper bag and take your bets. If your number hit that day, $1, $2 might get you $300 to $600. That's how the neighborhoods were run. The neighborhoods also, when I said there were 3 grocery stores in the neighborhood, one was run by the neighborhood gang. Yeah. And they weren't trying to take from people. Any parent of any family in my neighborhood could have a tab at the grocery store. There were a lot of families with a large amount of kids. I had 11 siblings. I have 11 siblings. It was 12 of us at that time. There was another family of 13. There was a family of 11. There was a family of 14. And there were several families of 5, 6, or 7 kids within the 2 or 3 blocks that I lived in and surrounding the block I was in. We didn't think of it as a good time, but it was. Grown ups worked. There were a lot of open secrets in these neighborhoods. And my definition of an open secret is this. I'll give you a personal example. My father passed away when I was 7 years old. Um, well, first, let me tell you about the Russian sailor hat. Then I'll tell you that. In the city, it got cold. So we were fortunate enough, we could get a pea coat, a navy pea coat to wear. Um, and if you got really fortunate, once you got a navy pea coat, you could get a Russian sailor hat. It's one of those hats that laid flat, but if you opened it up, you put it on your head, and maybe there were flaps to cover your ears, because one thing in the city we were all familiar with was the hawk. The hawk. The way the wind blowed around the buildings, the tall buildings. And in our mind, 4, 5, 6 stories tall was tall. Most stories in our building, in our neighborhood, were 3 stories high. All houses were 3 stories high. Those 3 story houses held about 4 bedrooms, but most all of them only held 1 bathroom. So I was 11 years old, and I used to run a lot of errands for my uncle to the grocery store. I was a kid that wanted things my mother couldn't afford. I was raised by my mother and my grandmother. I wanted things they couldn't afford. And I always thought I was clever. So I had a Russian sailor hat. And when my uncle would send me to the store, I would find ways to make that Russian sailor hat get me something I wanted. If you know anything about Philadelphia, there's 2 things that we love and we still love to this day. One is cheesesteaks, and the other is tasty cakes. Tasty cake had something called a honey bun, which, if I'm being accurate, is about that big. And it was about that thick. It was a wonderful tasting piece of cake to me. And it just so happened to fit perfectly in my Russian sailor hat. So one day I'm picking up Pall Mall cigarettes and Diet Pepsis from my uncle at Eccles Market, which was run by a family of black people, and they had it for about 40, 50 years. And I had devised means to come out of that with everything my uncle wanted and something I wanted too. So I managed to put a tasty cake, a honey bun, in my Russian sailor hat. And I was almost out the door when Tyrone Eccles, who had recently bought the store from his father, called me by name. He said, "Neal." And before I turned around, I thought that this man had caught me stealing this honey bun. My mom was going to have a fit about this. But when I turned around, he asked me, "Do you want a job?" I'm still concealing the honey bun. He asked me, did I want a job? I was 11 years old. I said yes. So I started at Eccles Market making $1.35 an hour, working after school and on weekends. And I stayed at that market from the time I was 11 until I was 18 and off my way to college. But the one thing I noticed when I talk about open secrets in my neighborhood was people would come in that store and always remind me, "You look just like your dad. You look just like your dad." Here's a little insight to the family structure of mine. I said there were 12 of us, 12 kids. I was raised by Irene Tallulah Bell, who's my grandmother, who lived to be 103 years old. And I was raised by Eleanor Agnes Bell, my mother, who lived to be 80 years old. The only man that ever lived in my house was my Uncle Linwood, who lived to be 85. Out of the 12 siblings, there were 4 fathers. None ever lived in the home, just us. And we never, ever, to this day, and from that day, never, ever spoke of each other as half brothers and half sisters. The word half never entered our vocabulary and still doesn't. But that was our family structure, and we were not singular to that structure in our neighborhood. That was Philadelphia at the time. And the open secrets was, to me, there were people who would come in and remind me of things about my father. In the same neighborhood, there were people to come in that knew Sis Bell, my mother. And then there were people in the neighborhood who were just always in the neighborhood that knew everything. I always asked about my father when you've never seen a picture of him. And every adult that comes by at some point in time says, "You look just like Detroit." So I inquired over years and years and years, and I've come to realize that what an open secret is in a North Philadelphia neighborhood is there's this portion that knows one part of the secret. There's this portion that might have knowledge of another part of the secret or the family. And then there's this portion, and none of these portions are talking together. It's not that they don't know, they don't want to know. That was the way our village ran. That was the way a lot of villages ran in Philadelphia at that time. But it didn't keep you from moving on. You learn very early on in Philadelphia that especially in the income that we were, the area that we were, you learn very early on that your goal is to survive through the next day. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to put things in this particular place. I do this to get to this. I do that to stay away from this. I do this for that reason. That was a learned behavior. And compartmentalizing became very beneficial to me because I wanted to leave Philadelphia. We had a lot of situations too with, even though the neighborhood gang was our neighborhood gang, they would not harm anybody in our neighborhood, whether we were part of the gang or not. I also found out working in a grocery store through the people who owned the store, the clientele that would come in there would mostly all be family-oriented clientele. And then there were people that would come in and want specific things. They would want a soda. They would want an orange. They didn't have any money. They want a pack of cigarettes. And after giving away so many oranges for my first year or two working in that store, I asked the owner, why do these guys always want an orange? I also noticed that they seem to have some type of dependency. Didn't seem like alcohol. Didn't seem like marijuana. It was something that took them away from where they were for that minute. I came to find out that the oranges, as told to me, were for syringes. These were people who were using heroin. The orange would at the same time give them some nutrients, but the acidity in the orange also helped clean their syringe. So I was told if anyone ever asked for an orange, just give them an orange. Years go by, I did pretty well in school. I was a pretty good athlete. I was a pretty good musician. And all that time, I never thought of the blessing I had, the blessing I was giving, because I didn't think about blessings then. I was compartmentalizing day to day getting out of Philadelphia or growing up in Philadelphia. But I never thought the fact that here is a young man working in a grocery store with 11 siblings that could help feed his family. Many weeks I took home some money, but anytime my mom and my grandma needed groceries, I could take home groceries. I could also take home enough that if I wanted to have an extra pork chop for myself that night, I'd come in from work and I could cook it myself. My younger sisters, the structure of my siblings is brother, 6 girls, me, girl, brother, 2 more girls. So when my younger siblings would remind me later on in life of the Jell-O pudding that I would bring home and hide in the shed kitchen just for them to have, it was just the benefits of being able to work in a grocery store. And I worked in that grocery store until I was time for me to go to college. Now, the other thing about that is you grow up fast. At 14, I always had a couple of dollars in my pocket. 15 and 16, I'm working in a store full of brothers in their 40s that had been in the Korean War and had been all around the world, and I'm thinking I can be like them. I'm carrying myself like them. Well, after a while, 16 to 17, you find yourself at this time in the city being able to walk into any bar, any establishment that sold alcoholic beverages in that neighborhood because everybody in that neighborhood knew everybody in that neighborhood. My mother worked hard. My mother worked for the traffic court in Philadelphia. And she worked 5 days a week. And then on Saturdays, I always remember people coming by the house with envelopes saying, here, get this to Miss Sis. That's what they call my mom, Sis Bell. There were envelopes given for us to give to her. When I was 13, 14, 15, there were always police officers in my home having cocktail parties. Good friends of my uncle. I remember to this day, the Jones brothers, both police officers. Sam was a police officer. There's a lot of guys who I don't know or have lost contact with, but they were police officers in my home. And I remember also trying to join the neighborhood gang at age 13 or 14 and coming home one night and seeing the police officers in my home forming what they called a rue. For those of you people who aren't familiar with a rue is a situation that when you're in a gang, if you want to get in a gang or you want to get out of the gang, you must go down this line of people on both sides hitting you with objects other than their fist. If you made it through to the other side, you could be successfully in the gang or you would have fought your way out. The Jones brothers were in my house and they said my mother had informed them that I was trying to join the gang. So if I could get through that row of police officers and my oldest brother, Wayne, who is 13 years older than me, if I could get through that line of people, I could join the gang. I didn't make it through. I didn't want to join. That was something that not everybody, that was an out not everybody had. So again, we grew up in this 3-story house. I still had ambitions. I had dreams. I wanted to do a lot of things. And looking back, I often wondered why there was not a lot of conversation with the adults, not only in my house, but in my neighborhood. Anybody of a certain age will understand when I'm saying that adults would tell us, speak when you're spoken to, stay in a child's place, all of the big hits, I'm not talking to you, mind your own business. All of these things are things happening in your house. What happens in this house stays in this house. That was about as long a conversation as you would get from a lot of adults. But I kept growing. I was a smart ass kid. Not just book smart. I was street smart. I made a certain amount of money every year. And when it's time for me to go to college, I hadn't saved a dime. So I asked the people who I worked for 8, 9 years to help me with some money to college. And they said no. Yeah, they said no. I don't know why that hurt my feelings, but it did. I remember talking to my mom about it, and she had nothing to say. I remember talking to my mom about my father, knowing that my other siblings, the 3 men that had followed all of them, were still alive, and my father died years ago, and me asking them for years, with people asking me or telling me how much I look like him, me asking her about him, I got no conversation. Very little at all. So when the people who I worked for chose not to help me with college, I'm still working in the store. At that point in time, the owner and his best friend, who is my uncle, another one of my uncles, would go out in the afternoon. Once I got home, once I got into work, they would go out in the afternoon and have parties, go to bars, just drink until the store closed, then come back, count up the money, lock the doors, and I would be gone. I had a young man who was my friend. His name was Matthew Kirkland. We all called him Junie. Junie reminded you of Curly on the Three Stooges. If you can picture Curly at 14 years old, that was Junie. And every afternoon, Junie and I would be in that store together. We would always be in that store. After a while, things changed. Um, People start going from heroin to other things. Uh, People started being more courageous in their theft. In my senior year in high school, Eccles was robbed once. I came back another time, Eccles was shot up in the window. One of the brothers had shot up the store window trying to shoot somebody. Things were changing in that neighborhood. I wanted to go to college then. I really did. And I remember when I found out the Echo brothers were not going to give me any money, or the one in particular, and he liked me, he really did. I don't understand why they wouldn't, but hey, maybe I should have saved the money I had. But I also remember um, being very good in math. I was a very good math student in high school. Good enough that I studied calculus 1 and 2 in high school. Good enough that my high school major was industrial chemistry. Yeah, I wanted to know how to make salt. Now, what I did find out about that too was I was paid good money to come up with a triple beam scale for somebody occasionally. But back to me being upset that I couldn't get any money for my college and being left in that store scared every weekend because we'd already been shot up once or twice and I had no money to go to college. And I'm making that now up to maybe about $2.50 an hour. But I was taking home $135 every week working in a store. Um, then we got an NCR cash register. Nobody knew how to work the NCR cash register but me. I mentioned I was really good at math. Well, the people in the neighborhood knew me so well that when they would kind of line up for their groceries, and whether they paid with food stamps, which we treated like dollar bills, and was also part of the commerce in our grocery store. Whether they paid with food stamps, whether they paid by the ladies going in their bra and pulling out their purse, whatever they paid, they trusted me. I was scared working in that store some days. And I was mad that no one wanted to help me with funds to go to college, right or wrong. So I devised a plan to help myself to college. The NCR machine, see, could only be opened up by putting the numbers, all that. Then the drawer would slide open. And inside the drawer, there was a little spot. One of the slots where you keep the bills had a slot where if you pulled out the dollar, an alarm would go off for the local police. So I knew that if I had 4 or 5 people standing in line, I could ring up what the first person had in line, the exact amount. And the register would open. I also knew that everybody trusted me because I had been there so long that I could look at the next person in line and add up what they had in my head while the cash register was open and take their money to put in the register. So, in review, I'm ringing up Miss High's Food. How you doing? And then I'm ringing it up. $26.12. Behind that, I see Miss Swanee. And Miss Swanee has a gallon of milk, a box of cereal, some bacon, so $16.12. So when the register is open, I take Miss High's money and I give her a change. And while the register is still open, I take Miss Swanee's money and give her change. All the while knowing I just rang up $29.12 for the store and just placed $16.12 in the register for me. Yeah. All of this went on until I graduated from high school. And I do remember July 5th, 1977, I'm in the store working and the door gets kicked open. I was on my way to college, back to college, but the door got kicked open that day. And 2 gentlemen walked in. Well, I'll call them gentlemen now. But 2 drug addicts walked in with a rifle. And I'm standing behind the counter. My guy, Junie, was in front of the meat counter, which had a walk-in freezer. And all I heard was a click, which means Junie had locked himself in the walk-in freezer. I'm standing out there. There were 5 ladies in line for groceries. And these 2 men kicked the door open and they said, "Give me the money." For some reason, I remember being amazingly calm, very calm. I gave them the money. I gave them all the money on top of the register. All the ladies in the store were so scared they had to put their heads down on the counter. And then one of the gentlemen, the one with the rifle, looked at me and said, "Okay, now I want you to come around here and lay down in front of me." And I'll never forget the phrase he used. He said, "'Cause you look like the hero type." I laid down in front of him. One other thing I was pretty good in high school at was track. I was part of an 880 relay team that's held the school record. I was the 3rd leg. And I said that I am now laying down in a track running position, but I'm not going to run because there was nothing but women in that store. The gentleman put the gun behind my ear. And I was honestly worried because he was shaking the whole time, and I just didn't want him to make a mistake. But he didn't shoot me. They grabbed the money, and they left. And everybody breathed a sigh of relief. But me. I went back to the register, and I remembered I gave them all the money on the top of the register. But I didn't give them the money underneath. So I lifted up the tray, and there was approximately $200 in 20s and 10s underneath. So while all the women were sobbing and worried and the police were on their way, I put that money in my pocket. And then I went back to the safe in the back room of the store, the safe that these master thieves never thought to ask about. And I saw money in there too. I took it out. I put it in my pocket. I put everything in my pocket but a roll of quarters because it was too damn big to fit. When my boss was reached, him and my uncle came back to the store And all the people were still there, and Sam, the neighborhood cop, had come in, kicked the door down, and again, which scared the shit out of me again. But they were informed that I was a hero, that I saved them. It also happened on this Saturday, July 5th, 1977, that I had just gotten paid. Yeah, I got paid that day. Take the money back to school. But I had went home for lunch. So I already put the money away. When my boss looked at me and said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Did they take your money too?" I said, "Yes." So I got repaid that day too. I ended up amassing about $564 that day. And that night, my boss asked to take me out for drinks. So we're going to the neighborhood bars. It was the Cosmopolitan. It was the Checker Club. We're going to these bars, and people are seeing me in the bar and say, "Hey, give little Neal a hit." Scotch. Everywhere I go, give little Neal a hit. Another shot of scotch. I was 18. Yeah, probably 17, 18. Give little Neal a hit. And these guys, the Echoes could hold their liquor so well. It was phenomenal to me at that time. Again, I'm a 139, 155 pound kid. I remember getting into one bar and I heard, "Give Neal a hit. Give little Neal a hit." I turned around and with the glassy eyes I had, looked down at the bar, and there were 5-shot glasses full of Dewar's Scotch waiting for me. There was no fucking way I was going to drink all that scotch. So when my boss said, "I got to go to the bathroom," I nodded, and as soon as he closed the bathroom door, I walked out the front door. Now, the bars in the city had entrances on both sides. I don't remember which entrance I left, but I walked out. And I remember gliding along the wall to get to my home, which was around the corner. I don't know who saw me. I don't know what they thought I was doing, but I got into my house, and my mother basically helped take care of me that night. The next day, she looked at me and she said, "Who's Kathy?" I said, "What are you talking about?" "Some girl you were talking about the whole time I was cleaning you up from being drunk." And then, like I said, we never really talked that much. But my mother understood who I was. So I cleaned myself up. The next day, I'm headed out. And I looked at my mother and I said, "Mom, I'm going out to hang with my boys." And I had never been drunk before. The night that she cleaned me up, I had never been drunk like that before. And my mom stopped me and she looked at me and she said, "I'm going to tell you one thing." I said, "What is it?" She said, "Have fun." Okay, you know I'm going to do that. I'm going to smoke me some weed and all that. Then she looked at me and she said, "One other thing." I said, "What?" She said, "The rule is white liquor in the summertime, dark liquor in the winter." It was July. White liquor in the summertime, dark liquor in the winter. Some of the best advice she ever gave me. Thanks for listening. This is the Talk It Out podcast with Neal Bailey-Harper. I'll talk to you soon.